Hello and welcome to Dialogue. 95 years ago, the forerunner of the People's Liberation Army was founded by the Communist Party of China. Since then, the army has safeguarded the country through a series of crises and hardships. 95 years on, what's required from the PLA in this era, and how will it face new regional and global challenges? To discuss these questions and more, I'm glad to be joined by Zhou Bo, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Strategy and Security at Tsinghua University, Yang Xiyu, Senior Fellow at the China Institute of International Studies, Brian Boletic, a geopolitical analyst and a former U.S. Marine. And later on, we have Digby Ren, political analyst and international relations scholar at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Zhou Bo, I will start with you. 1927 to 2022, 97 years. 95 years. So how do you characterize the development of the PLA over the past decades?
Well, that's really a very, very big issue. I'm afraid I just cannot, put it in a small box. But overall, I believe everybody would agree that the PLA is growing with strength. The fact is, the PLA has not been involved in war since 1979, as this is pointed out sometimes by foreign experts or military watchdogs. But a few people would deny that the PLA, of course, is much stronger. In 1979, China's objective is to have PLA becoming world-class military by mid-century. But I was quite interested to read my president's speech yesterday, who actually called for PLA to speed up its progress to become world-class military.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, sitting in Thailand and look at the development of the People's Liberation Army, in particular recent years, the modernization efforts of PLA. How do how does the PLA stack up against militaries of, say, U.S. or Russia?
It's always hard to tell until one military goes up against the other. But there are a lot of examples we can look at that are very similar, like the performance of Russian military equipment in Ukraine, for example. I think the West very much underestimated not only the performance of these systems, but the industrial base that produced them. A lot of systems that China uses today were originally developed and designed by the Soviet Union or by Russia, and then there were indigenous additions to them. Coupled together with China's massive industrial base, I think it would be a very big mistake for Western powers to underestimate the capabilities there.
Mm-hmm. Well, Xiyu, Monday there's a reception celebration for the 95th anniversary of PLA. Chinese Defense Minister Wei Fenghe said in a speech, for this occasion, that the PLA will strive to become a modernized world-class military, as Zhou Bo mentioned earlier, that can meet China's security needs and the developmental interests. So please tell us more about China's quote here, security needs and the development interests.
Well, security needs is the most important thing and the most important challenge facing PLA, simply because China's security situation in recent years has been more and more complicated and more and more challenging, both from our internal affairs like the division between the mainland and the Taiwan island, but also increasing threats and challenges made by the U.S., the so-called Indo-Pacific strategy targeting at China. So facing our domestic problems for the unification and as well the external challenges, I think the security needs is really is under the changing. So in short, the needs is increasing. That required the PLA should be at a higher level of the modernization. That is the objective situation. And meanwhile, with the progress of the building of PLA, the military force itself really need they update their modernization progress So both for the internal and external factors, and both for the challenge and PLA's internal needs, I think the security needs and the military build-ups is making more and more urgent situation on PLA. So in short, PLA will certainly speed up its effort, speed up its military build-ups and modernization, and make a greater efforts for the modernization of the PLA.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joe Bo, of course, it needs to point out like among the five UN Security Council permanent members of the UN Security Council, China is the only one which is yet to achieve its full national reunification. At the same time, recently the NATO has shifted its attention to China too. So that's posing a potential threat or challenge to China's security. So there's indeed a necessity for China to further modernize, further develop the defense capability, let's say.
Yes, of course. But I'm happy you mentioned NATO, but I do disagree with you slightly on the capability of NATO to develop itself, even in this direction. Actually, NATO would become 32 members strong after receiving Finland and Sweden to become NATO members. But I believe that probably would be very much the end of expansion, because if you look at the candidates on the list, only 2-3 other countries are just left. But I believe Ukraine and Georgia's application already doomed. And then Bosnia, well, Russia has also warned against it, because NATO is a military organization and all military alliances live on so-called threats. Therefore, for NATO to survive, it has to expand. But I doubt whether it could still expand, because the security in Europe eventually depends on how Russia and the NATO coexist. And in this part of the world, whether you call it Asia, Asia Pacific, Indo Pacific, apart from a few sporadic sailings by Britain, France, Germany, there isn't much saying done really by Europe. So I doubt if NATO wants to establish so-called Asian NATO, it can succeed.
Mm-hmm. But Joe Bo, probably when the defense minister said that China should speed up this world modernization and also this the building of a world-class military on the Chinese side, there's also this recent development or the new reality. You have AUKUS, for example, the U.S., UK, and Australia. You have the Quad, U.S., Japan, Australia, India, and then you have this Indo-Pacific concept, the strategy basically all targeting China plus NATO, and then you have an issue of Taiwan and the South China Sea. You do need I would say, rather strong military force to protect the Chinese interests.
Yes, of course that is true. But what I mean is that regardless of what challenges we're going to have, PLA actually has its clear targets to meet. That is to become a world military by mid-century, and we're just speeding up this process backed by the strong political determination and a robust defense investment, which, although lower than 2%, is still the second largest in the world and 3 times larger than Russia. So actually the war in Ukraine raised a question about Chinese military standing. So we in China like to say that we want to become a world-class military. But if the world-class military is not only one, is not only the United States, where are we now? I'm talking about now. If you compare China with the UK, the United Kingdom should be among one of the strongest military. I doubt about it, because any of the Chinese 3 fleet now is larger than all the surface combined of the Royal Navy. Mm-hmm. So we are already among one of the strongest. If you do not mean the strongest is the only one.
Mm-hmm. But of course, there is the issue of basically the defense policy or the purpose of developing the military. She, speak of that. The Chinese leaders, Chinese documents have repeatedly stressed that China never seeks hegemony. Probably China is the only big power on the world stage, making it public that China will never seek hegemony.
Yep. I think from generation of generation Chinese top leader from Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, we have been repeatedly saying China will not seek hegemony. However, most of Western countries don't believe that because of two reasons. One reason is they have indeed gone through the path for the hegemony based on their capability and strength. Their logic is capability drives intention. So now that China's capability, especially the PLA's capability, is increasing, from their logic, they believe the increased capability of the PLA will certainly support China to seek hegemony. That is their logic. That is their historical experiences. But China, under the Chinese Communist Party's leadership, we follow the totally different logic from the Western. Western is capability drives intention, but we, China, including PLA, follow this logic, say our firm beliefs drives intention.
Mm-hmm.
The firm beliefs of China is we believe based on the communism, based on Marxism. So communism and the Marxism do not include the term or keywords about expansion, invasion, or hegemony.
Mm-hmm.
We seek for peace. We seek for equality of all nations of the human being. So we are acting on the totally different logic and the totally different doctrine from the Western countries.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the so-called China threats stem from Western logic will be removed by China's steadily efforts for peace-building efforts. With time going, I believe that the world will believe China's position.
Yes, Brian, I still remember the former Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir once said that, we and China are neighbors for thousands of years. China never invaded us, but when we met the Europeans the second year, they colonized Malaysia. So how do the neighbors, how do other countries see that, in particular in this region, see the development of the Chinese military force?
I think they see it as a very positive development, a check and balance against invasive Western, I would say, interference in the region. And I think you can see how a lot of these countries, especially here in Southeast Asia, here in Thailand, still perceived by many as a very close U.S. ally. But actually, in recent years, the relationship with China has been growing quite a bit, and that includes militarily. People like to repeat this Cold War myth that Thailand is this non-NATO ally of the United States, but they replaced all their main battle tanks with Chinese VT-4s, and a lot of equipment actually is being purchased from China. And I think it is in this collective belief that other nations are rising with China, and as China's military grows, it's a check and balance against, just like you were saying, this generational sense of threat from the West, the colonizing, and even in these modern times, interfering and coercing.
Mm-hmm. Well, Brian, a follow-up question. Obviously, there is a strong presence in this region of U.S. military force. Recently, U.S. General Mark Milley has criticized, accused the Chinese military force of being aggressive in the South China Sea. What do you make of that?
I think it's projection. The United States is looking for an excuse to maintain its own unwarranted military presence in this region, thousands of miles away from America's own shores. So a lot of what we hear about being Chinese aggression, it really is just the U.S. provoking a response from China that if it were the other way around, if it was actually China crossing the Pacific to interfere along the coasts of America, it would not be tolerated for even a moment. And I think that's something that people should always consider when thinking about China as an aggressor. Just think of it if it was the other way around, if it was China on the other side of the Pacific.
Well, that's an interesting point. The same question to you, Zhou Bo. The South China Sea is where you do see the U.S., a strong U.S. presence, and then the Chinese, of course, Chinese force trying to defend the Chinese interests over there, and then there are some occasional, let's say, confrontation. I'm not sure that's proper, but anyway, the engagement over there. What do you make of this critique from General Milley?
Well, I think that is not right at all, because I myself went to Pentagon to lead the Chinese delegation to discuss about freedom and navigation. I would say that we have fundamental differences in our understanding of the same laws, that is UN Convention on Law of the Sea. But the US would believe that it has a right to sail unimpededly anywhere in the world. But China would consider that in doing so, you have to pay due regard to the rights and interests of littoral states and for peaceful purposes. And these principles are also enshrined in UN Convention on Law of the Sea. So when we talk about crisis management, I believe it is the wishes of both China and the United States to de-conflict, to have a crisis management mechanism in place. But the problem is that because of our differences in understanding of all these rules and regulations, so even some of the rules that we have already established, such as a rule of behavior during maritime and air encounters, or a code for unplanned encounter at sea, would not really work that well because we have differences in understanding. For example, what is safe distance? Of course, both sides want to keep safe distance, but what is safe distance? At the sea, if the ships are of different size, if we have different speed of wind, or the speed of the ships, so this concept of safe distance could actually change. So for both sides, to avoid miscalculation, we too have to, talk more to each other and even practice, real exercises as we did in the past.
Mm-hmm. Well, as Nigel talked about, the relationship between Chinese military force and the U.S. military force, and then there's another case in point. Probably here we have Digby Ren, a political analyst and an international relations scholar at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. Welcome to the show, Digby. So here is a case I want to mention is Pelosi's visit or proposed visit, but people increasingly believe she will visit Taiwan. That's a clear violation, breach of the One China principle, and of course, people are talking about probably a potential crisis that will be generated because of her visit. What do you make of her visit? What is the purpose and probably an outcome? There are consequences, from the Chinese side they would see.
Yeah, well, in and of itself, I believe this is an activity that undermines the status quo. And it challenges the entire political and security architecture of the region. Look, it's no coincidence that Pelosi's on-again, off-again trip is dominating international media, and it's obscuring China's efforts at peaceful reunification, which is, almost unanimously supported by UN membership. So clearly the US is undermining regional stability while saying it's protecting a free and open Indo-Pacific. Look, I think this trip is, in many ways, it's obscuring the fact that there's a U.S. carrier group arriving near Taiwan right now. It's also obscuring any media message that's related to the Ba-E, the PLA 95th anniversary. And I think in many ways it's a concerted effort by the U.S. government to destabilize the region, but at the same time, dominate the narrative in Western media that is going to cast a relatively negative light on China, and it's all bad news basically.
Mm-hmm. Well, she explain to us in particular for viewers from other parts of the world who are not familiar. that familiar with this Taiwan question, Taiwan issue. Why China? I mean, this Beijing, the Chinese central government is so upset about the visit. So Zhou Bo, maybe it seems like we lost Xu. Yeah.
So here's a lot.
Yeah, Zhou Bo, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, so this issue, of course, is most important for China. And I believe a response from Chinese government and even from Chinese military this time is unprecedented. So some people would argue that why should China, really worry about this? Time is on your side. But what if people like Pelosi keep on, poking China in the eyes? And I read actually all the international media on her visit, and I believe I still have yet to find a single report that would say she's doing the right thing, because she really is, provoking China out of nowhere. And this is so important for us that the third most important person in the United States wants to make a visit to China. Make a visit to Taiwan. And so I don't believe we'll bear with it this time. Our spokesman has made it clear that the Chinese people will honor what we have said. We have to wait and see.
Yeah.
But I hope she might have received such a warning and would not, go on this fool's errand.
Well, today I think the Australian Prime Minister made it clear that Australia follow this one China principle, and obviously he fully understands the importance of regional peace and stability, because probably I guess he also sees the so-called visit is unnecessary and provocative. There's a point of view that if China fails to do something or fails to respond in a strong, powerful way, and then in a forceful way, probably there will be like a broken window theory. Some other speakers or parliamentary leaders from European countries, from European the parliament will also go to visit Taiwan, and then the One China principle will be completely hollowed out.
Well, this is exactly what the US is trying to structure. Is in fact to salami slice that policy, and slowly degrade that policy. Look, I was in England a week ago, and I had people at a dinner party tell me that Taiwan was an independent country and the United Kingdom recognized it. And I sat at that table. I was the only person who said that is completely false. There is virtually no country in the world that recognizes Taiwan. The UK recognizes Taiwan as a province of China. So does the US, and so does 187 other countries. 178 other countries. So what this is doing is just weakening. It's really for the Western narrative, you see. But it in some way, it also tests the resolve of China. But, on the 95th anniversary of the PLA, one has to understand that China's policy is always to avoid conflict. There is better strategies out there. And I think that China is going to be very, very careful about this, say in very, very uncertain, strong terms about its red lines. And the US recognizes this. And I think the grounding of the F-35s, for example, shows that the US is at some point also not going to push this that far. But look, it only increases tensions. The ultimate goal here is to destabilize the region and to try and destabilize China. And I don't think it's going to work, but we're going to go through very choppy waters until the November midterm elections in America, where Biden is most probably going to lose both houses, and Nancy Pelosi is probably going to lose her seat. She's not going to be the speaker any longer. So this is kind of a final hurrah.
Yeah, the midterm election in the U.S. Yes, there's a demonstration of this strong resolution on the Chinese side, and also the military force, the PLA, in terms of defending the national interests, national sovereignty, territorial integrity. But at the same time, I want to point out, that the defense budget of China, less than 2% of its of its GDP is actually lower. I think it's about 1.3, less than 1.5, much lower than the 2% requirement of NATO member countries. What does that say about Chinese defense policy?
Well, you're touching a very key point that has been made repeatedly by Western countries. They always exaggerate China's increasing defense budget to support their demonize China by saying the so-called China threat. But you're right. In terms of the same standard, say, for example, percentage of GDP, and China's military forces, say PLA's expenditures, has been much lower than most of the Western countries, especially when U.S. asked all of its allied states to increase their military budgets up to 2%. And meanwhile, they criticize China's military budget. So it's ridiculous. It's double standards. And I don't think the Western policy makers really believe PLA is a threat. They just want to make use of the China threats as an excuse to maintain and strengthen the Western allies, because the common knowledge is the so-called common enemy, common threats is the base or precondition for maintaining the allies. So for strengthening and maintaining the allies led by the United States, U.S. has been keep trying efforts to make the so-called China threats wordings. So I think no matter how Western, especially U.S., describes China's military budget stress, the fact is China as one of the largest country with one of the largest territories, we really need a large amount of a military budget. But compared with the U.S., and we remain spending much smaller military budget. If we set the same standards, I think it is the U.S., it is most of Western countries, they should reduce their military budget rather than China.
Yes. We'll speak of the global presence, speak of the development. In a global power, China is, so is the U.S. Zhou Bo, obviously, how do you position the role of the PLA in a global scale? Speak of that, unlike the U.S., which has, hundreds of military bases around the world, China is actually the largest contributor to the peacekeeping force, the peacekeepers in terms of number to the UN peacekeeping missions around the world.
Well, I'm happy you mentioned peacekeeping, because if you put all the military operations of PLA overseas all together, you would find that they actually for the same purpose, that is addressing non-traditional threat, be it peacekeeping, counter-piracy, or disaster relief. So that tells a lot about the role of PLA overseas. Of course, all countries would have territorial defense as their priority, but China is a major power. And what makes a major power different? It has two more missions. For China, it has to safeguard its ubiquitous overseas interest. Number two, it has to shoulder its great responsibility as a major power. And this is best exemplified, for example, in PLA's operation in the Gulf of Aden and Somali Basin, where the Chinese flotillas escorted not only Chinese ships, but also foreign ships as well. So China, I believe in the future, doesn't want to become a world cup at all. It wants to become instead a good Samaritan.
Well, on that note, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.